At 6:14 a.m. on September 28, 2022, every John Deere combine in Sheridan County, Nebraska, stopped working at the same time. Not mechanically. The engines still ran, the headers still turned, the grain tanks still held grain. But the computers died. The diagnostic screens went black. The yield monitors froze. The auto steer disengaged. The GPS guidance systems dropped signal. The moisture sensors stopped reading. The grain flow sensors stopped reporting. The most advanced harvesting machines ever built, each one carrying more computing power than the Apollo spacecraft, were suddenly, silently, completely blind. It was a firmware update. John Deere's Connected Services platform had pushed an automatic software patch at 6 a.m. Central Time, and the patch had a bug, a conflict between the new GPS module driver and the existing CAN bus communication protocol that caused a cascade failure across every electronic control unit in the machine. In a car, this would be an inconvenience. Pull over, call the dealer, wait for a tow truck. In a combine during harvest, this was a catastrophe. Sheridan County had 47 John Deere combines operating that morning. 47 machines worth a combined $32 million, sitting in 47 fields across 280,000 acres of corn and soybeans that were ready to harvest and would begin losing quality every day they sat in the field. The John Deere dealer in Alliance Panhandle Implement was swamped. The phone rang 53 times in the first hour. The service manager, a man named Greg Kelsey, had 4 technicians. 4 technicians for 47 dead combines spread across a county the size of Connecticut. Greg called the regional service center in Omaha. The regional center called Moline. Moline called the software team. The software team identified the bug by 8 a.m. and began working on a fix. The fix arrived at 2 p.m., 8 hours after the crash. It had to be installed manually by a certified technician using a proprietary diagnostic laptop that cost $14,000 and required a dealer-specific security dongle to operate. 4 technicians, 47 combines. Each installation took 45 minutes. The math was simple and brutal. It would take Greg's team 8 days to reach every machine. 8 days of combines sitting idle. 8 days of corn drying past optimal moisture. 8 days of soybeans shattering in the pods. 8 days of money dying on the stalk. Some farmers tried to override the computers, disconnect the CAN bus, bypass the electronic controls, run the machines in manual mode. It didn't work. Modern combines are built around their computers the way modern cars are built around their engines. Remove the computer and the machine doesn't degrade gracefully. It doesn't work at all. The header height control needs the GPS. The separator speed needs the yield monitor. The grain tank level sensor needs the CAN bus. Everything is connected to everything. By noon, the panic had set in. Farmers were driving to Alliance to stand in line at the dealership. The coffee pot in the waiting room was empty. The parking lot was full. The phones were still ringing. By 10 a.m., the first insurance calls started. Crop adjusters were being notified. Bankers were calling farmers. Farmers were calling lawyers. The whole county was vibrating with the low-frequency panic of people who understood that time was money and they were hemorrhaging both. Dennis Horak sat on the tailgate of his truck in his soybean field and did the math on the back of an envelope. His beans were at 12% moisture, perfect for harvest. Every day they sat in the field, the pods would continue to dry. Below 10%, the pods would start shattering. The beans would fall on the ground, unharvested, unrecoverable, gone. Dennis had 280 acres of soybeans at 52 bushels per acre at $13.80 per bushel. That was $201,000 standing in his field. Every day of delay cost him roughly 2% in shattering losses, $4,000 a day, falling on the ground like pennies through a hole in your pocket. He'd bought his S780 18 months ago, $485,000, financed over 7 years at 4.9%. The monthly payment was $6,800. He was making payments on a machine that was sitting in his field with a black screen and an error code that nobody could fix for a week. Dennis put the envelope in his pocket and stared at his combine. The most advanced harvesting machine John Deere had ever built. 32 sensors, 4 cameras, a touchscreen the size of a laptop, the ability to map yields in real time, adjust header height to the centimeter, and transmit performance data to a satellite that beamed it to a server in Iowa that generated reports that Dennis could read on his phone while sitting in his living room. All of it useless, all of it dead, because someone in an office in Moline had pushed a button. Harold Brinkman had a different problem. His corn was at 17% moisture. The window for number 2 grade corn was 15.5%. Below 15%, the kernels would crack and the grade would drop to number 3, costing $0.15 per bushel. Above 18%, the corn needed to be dried before storage, costing $0.08 per bushel per point of moisture removed. Harold's corn was perfect right now. In 5 days it would be too dry. In 3 days, it would start cracking. The combine that sat dead in his field was the only thing standing between Harold and a quality downgrade that would cost him $24,000. That's when Merle Jansen showed up. Let me tell you about Merle, because you need to understand the man before you can understand why what happened next was more than just a harvest story. Merle was 79 years old. He'd farmed 640 acres in Sheridan County since 1966, when he came home from 2 years at the community college in Scottsbluff with an associate's degree in diesel mechanics and a conviction that the best way to understand a machine was to build one yourself, take it apart, build it again, and keep doing that until the machine became an extension of your hands. He'd raised wheat, corn, and soybeans on the same land for 56 years. He'd survived the farm crisis of the 1980s, when the interest rate on his operating loan hit 21%, and he'd sat at his kitchen table at 3 a.m. with a calculator and a bottle of bourbon, and figured out that he was exactly $11,400 away from bankruptcy. He sold his cattle to cover the gap. He didn't drink bourbon again for 15 years. He'd survived the flood of 1993, the drought of 2012, and the trade war of 2018 that had dropped soybean prices by 30% in 6 months and turned every farmer in Nebraska into a reluctant student of international trade policy. Through all of it, 56 years of weather, markets, politics, and the slow grinding machinery of an agricultural economy that rewarded scale and punished independence. Merle had kept one thing that every other farmer in the county had thrown away: his combine. He drove a 2004 Ford F-350 with a flat tire and a cracked windshield. He wore bib overalls and a cap from a seed company that had gone out of business in 1997. His boots were held together with duct tape and stubbornness, and behind his truck, on a lowboy trailer that was older than most of the farmers waiting at the grain elevator, sat a 1,979 Gleaner L2 combine. The Gleaner was not a beautiful machine. It was silver and red, which was the Gleaner color scheme, but the silver had faded to gray, and the red had faded to pink, and there were patches of rust on the grain tank, and the right side panel was dented from the time Merle's grandson had backed into it with a grain truck in. The Gleaner had 6,400 hours on it. It had been through 43 harvests. Its header was a 2.0, foot-rigid platform, no flex, no auto height, no sensors. Its separator was a transverse rotary design that Gleaner had patented in the 1970s, and that some farmers considered the most efficient threshing system ever built. It had no computer, no GPS, no yield monitor, no auto steer, no moisture sensor, no CAN bus, no firmware, no software, nothing to update, nothing to crash. Nothing to break that couldn't be fixed with a wrench, a hammer, and a $3 belt from the auto parts store. Merle drove to the grain elevator on Highway 87. He didn't go to the dealership. He went to where the farmers were. 8 of them were there, standing around their trucks, drinking coffee from thermoses, talking about the crash and the wait time and the money they were losing every hour. Merle backed up his trailer, unloaded the Gleaner, and climbed up to the cab. He turned the key. The Gleaner's engine, a 6-cylinder diesel that Alice Chalmers had built in the late 1970s, turned over once, coughed, and then settled into a low, steady rumble that sounded like a grandfather clearing his throat. Merle looked down at the 8 farmers. "I can't do your whole crop," he said, "but I can start." "Who's closest?" Dennis Horak raised his hand. His farm was 3 miles south. His soybeans were dry and ready, and his $485,000 John Deere S780 was sitting in the field with a black screen and a yield monitor that read Error Code 4471. Merle drove the Gleaner to Dennis's field and started cutting soybeans. Let me describe what that looked like. Because if you've never seen a 1979 Gleaner L2 work, you need to understand why the farmers who watched it that day stood in silence. The Gleaner was designed by a company called Alice Chalmers, which was later bought by AGCO, which eventually discontinued the Gleaner name and replaced it with machines that looked like spaceships and cost more than most houses. But in 1979, the Gleaner L2 was a masterpiece of simplicity. The engine was a 6-cylinder Alice Chalmers diesel, naturally aspirated, producing about 165 horsepower. No turbocharger, no intercooler, no emissions controls, no catalytic converter, no DEF fluid, just fuel, air, compression, and combustion. The same basic principle that Rudolf Diesel had demonstrated in 1893. The separator was the Gleaner's secret weapon. While most combines used a conventional cylinder and concave system to thresh grain, essentially beating the grain out of the head, the Gleaner used a transverse rotary design. The crop entered the machine and was fed into a rotating cylinder that worked like a gentle centrifuge, separating grain from straw through sustained contact rather than brute force. It was smoother, quieter, and produced less damaged grain than any conventional system on the market. Some farmers, the old ones, the ones who cared about grain quality more than harvest speed, believed the Gleaner rotary separator was the finest threshing mechanism ever designed. Merle was one of them. The Gleaner moved at 3.5 miles per hour. Dennis's S780 could do 6. The Gleaner's header was 20 feet wide. The S780's was 40. The Gleaner's grain tank held 200 bushels. The S780's held 400. On paper, the Gleaner was half the machine, maybe less. But the Gleaner was moving. The S780 was not. And 200 bushels per tank load at 3.5 miles per hour was infinitely more than 400 bushels per tank load at 0 miles per hour. Merle cut Dennis's soybeans for 14 hours that first day. He started at 7 a.m., when the dew burned off, and he stopped at 9 p.m. when the moisture started climbing again. He ate his lunch in the cab, a ham sandwich Lena had made at 5 a.m., and he drank coffee from a thermos that was so old the plaid pattern had worn off and the glass liner had been replaced twice with liners from newer thermoses that had broken first. He unloaded 23 tank loads. He harvested 62 acres. The grain was clean. The sample grade was number 1. The moisture was 11.8%, right where it should be. Dennis's total field was 280 acres. At Merle's pace, it would take 5 days. Dennis's S780, if it were working, would have done it in 2. But 5 days is not 8 days, and 5 days was the difference between harvesting the crop and watching it shatter on the ground. Dennis's S780 sat at the edge of the field the entire time, like a sleeping giant, expensive, and useless, and magnificent in its paralysis. The afternoon sun glinted off its dark screens and its polished panels and its 40-foot header that could swallow 4 rows at a time, if only someone in an office in Illinois could figure out how to make the software talk to the hardware again. Word spread. By the second day, Merle had a schedule. He was cutting for Dennis in the morning and for Harold Brinkman in the afternoon. Harold's situation was worse. His corn was at 17% moisture and dropping toward 15%. And below 15 the kernels would start to crack, and the quality grade would drop from number 2 to number 3, costing him $0.15 per bushel across 400 acres. Merle cut Harold's corn at 3 miles per hour. The Gleaner's cylinder chewed through the stalks with the patient efficiency of a machine that had been doing this for 43 years and saw no reason to hurry. The corn went through the rotary separator and came out the other side clean and whole, with less kernel damage than most modern machines produced at twice the speed. Harold stood at the edge of his field and watched the Gleaner work. He'd bought his first GPS-equipped combine in 2004. He'd upgraded to a fully connected machine in 2018. He'd spent $900,000 on 2 combines over 18 years, and right now both of them were parked in his machine shed with error codes on their screens and service appointments that wouldn't happen until Thursday. The Gleaner was worth maybe $8,000. If Merle were generous about it, it had no resale value to anyone except a museum or a man who understood that resale value is not the same thing as actual value. By the third day, Merle's phone was ringing. Farmers he hadn't talked to in years, farmers from the next county, farmers who had laughed at him for 20 years for keeping that old Gleaner when everyone else had upgraded to GPS-guided, satellite-connected, computer-controlled combines that could harvest 1,000 acres a day without the operator touching the steering wheel. They weren't laughing now. "Merle, can you come do my west field? I've got 200 acres of corn and the dealer says Thursday." "Merle, my beans are shattering. I need someone there today." "Merle, I'll pay you double custom rate. Triple. Name your price." Merle didn't charge triple. He charged his normal custom harvesting rate, $35 per acre for beans, $38 per acre for corn, the same rate he'd charged since 2018. The same rate that every farmer in the county knew was fair because Merle had been fair about everything for 56 years. A younger man might have seized the opportunity. Supply and demand. Scarcity pricing. The market would have supported $100 per acre, and every farmer in the county would have paid it because the alternative was losing their crop. But Merle was not a younger man, and Merle's understanding of business had been formed in an era when the price you charged was the same price you'd charge your neighbor, because your neighbor was the man who would pull your truck out of a ditch in January and bring your wife groceries when you were in the hospital and sit with you at the co-op on Saturday morning and tell you lies about the fish he almost caught. You don't gouge your neighbors. That was one of those rules that didn't need to be written down because it was written in something more permanent than ink. By the 4th day, 2 other farmers with old machines had joined in. Wayne Lofelholtz brought his 1,984. John Deere 6,620, a pre-computer combine with a mechanical header, height control, and an analog tachometer, and a cab that rattled so badly at full speed that Wayne wore earplugs, and communicated with his grain cart driver through hand signals. But the 6,620 ran. It ran because it had nothing in it that could be updated, patched, hacked, crashed, or bricked by a server in another state. Carl Reinke brought his 1,991, Case IA 1,660, also pre-computer, also analog, also perfectly functional. Carl's 1,660 had a cracked windshield that he'd been meaning to replace since 2009 and a heater blower that only worked on high, which meant the cab was either freezing or tropical with no setting in between. But the separator worked, the header worked, the engine worked, And in September of 2022, that was enough. 3 old combines. 3 old farmers. Cutting through Sheridan County's harvest at half speed but full capability, while $32 million worth of modern equipment sat in fields with dead screens and error codes. There was a moment on the 5th day that nobody talked about afterward, but everybody remembered. Merle was cutting corn in Harold's south field, running east along the quarter line, when a John Deere service truck pulled up at the end of the row. A young technician got out, couldn't have been older than 25, with a diagnostic laptop under his arm and a look on his face like a man who had been driving for 14 hours straight, which he probably had. He was there to fix Harold's combine. He walked past the Gleaner without looking at it because he was focused on the S780 parked 200 yards away, the machine with the problem he'd been sent to solve. Merle finished his row, turned around, and pulled up beside the service truck. He shut down the Gleaner and climbed down. He walked over to the young technician, who was already connecting cables to the S780's diagnostic port. The kid looked up. His name tag said, Ryan. "Can I help you?" Ryan asked. Merle looked at the S780. Then he looked at Ryan. Then he looked at his Gleaner. "Nope," Merle said. "Just wanted to see what the future looks like." Ryan glanced at the Gleaner. He almost smiled. Then he plugged in his laptop and started typing. 45 minutes later, the S780 was back online. The screens lit up, the GPS locked on, the auto steer engaged. The yield monitor began calibrating. Ryan packed his laptop, shook Harold's hand, and drove to the next farm. He had 6 more combines to fix today. As he pulled out of the field road, he passed the Gleaner sitting at the end of the row. Merle was pouring coffee from his thermos. The Gleaner's engine was ticking in the cooling air. Ryan stopped his truck. He rolled down his window. "Hey," he said. Merle looked up. "That's a nice machine," Ryan said. He meant it. Merle nodded. "She does the job," he said. Ryan drove away. Merle finished his coffee, climbed back on the Gleaner, and went back to work. The John Deere fix reached the last combine on day 8, exactly as Greg Kelsey had predicted. By then, Merle and Wayne and Carl had harvested approximately 4,200 acres between them, about 15% of the county's total crop, and had prevented an estimated $1.2 million in quality losses from delayed harvest. On the 9th day, Dennis Horak's S780 was back online. The screen glowed, the yield monitor read, the auto steer engaged. The GPS locked onto 14 satellites and calculated its position to within 2 centimeters. Dennis drove it to the field where Merle was still cutting the last 40 acres of Dennis's beans. He parked the S780 at the end of the row and watched the Gleaner work. Watched the 2-0 foot header moving through the beans, watched the silver tank filling, watched Merle, 79 years old, steering with one hand and drinking coffee with the other. No screen, no monitor, no satellite, just eyes and hands and 56 years of knowing what ripe soybeans look like. Dennis walked over to the Gleaner when Merle pulled up to unload. Merle rolled down the window. The cab didn't have air conditioning. It didn't have a radio. It had a seat, a steering wheel, and a clear view of the header. "My combine has GPS, auto steer, yield monitors, and a satellite uplink," Dennis said. "Yours has a seat and a steering wheel, and yours just saved my harvest." Merle poured the last of his coffee out the window. "Your combine can see 14 satellites," Merle said. "Mine can see the field. Some days, the field is enough." Merle finished Dennis's beans that afternoon. Then he loaded the Gleaner on the trailer, drove home, parked it in the machine shed, and plugged in the block heater. The Gleaner had run for 9 days straight, 127 hours. It hadn't missed a beat. The engine didn't overheat. The separator didn't plug. The header didn't jam. Nothing crashed, because there was nothing to crash. John Deere issued a formal apology for the firmware incident. They offered service credits to affected farmers. They implemented new testing protocols for over-the-air updates. They promised it wouldn't happen again. It happened again. Not the same bug, a different one. In 2024, smaller scale, fewer machines affected, but it happened. Merle's Gleaner is still in the machine shed. Merle is 81 now. His grandson, the one who dented the side panel, is 28 and has taken over the farm. The grandson runs a 2023 John Deere X9 with every computer option available. But the Gleaner stays. It stays because the grandson learned something in September of 2022 that his generation was never taught. The most reliable machine is the one that doesn't depend on anything except the man sitting in the seat. The Gleaner starts every fall. The engine turns over. The header drops. The separator spins. No update required.